So the next speaker is very entitled in Eastern philosophies from Latvian University, Kaspars. Eihmanis, I'm very happy that you're here and you're ready to give us your speech and tell maybe also a little bit about how you came to interest of Eastern knowledge. Why this topic? Because we know that somebody say that we are Latvians and we have to take about our own traditions and what does it means for us here in Latvia and how we meet India and Eastern Oriental wisdom.
All right. Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to speak at this gathering. I do apologize, I call it a gathering. It's not properly a conference, because a conference would involve at least 10 or 15 minutes of rebuttals of the previous speakers. And oh boy, I have so many, especially when it comes to distinguished Latvian colleagues. The problem is that the ongoing project that you might have suffers from one serious problem. You lack a well-trained philosopher. I myself am professional philosopher, but with background, first of all, in Chinese philosophy. And later on, I moved on to Indian Middle Age Indian Buddhist philosophy of consciousness. Sanskrit and Pali are not my first languages. My first language is classical Chinese. Most of the texts of ancient Indian Buddhist school of Sarvastivada are preserved only in classical Chinese. They're lost in Sanskrit. Therefore, classical Chinese comes in very handy. Therefore, since my talk is about the dialogue between Indian philosophy and Western philosophy in general, but there is one historical note aside that the first culture to encounter Indian modes of thought were China. And besides, it was completely different linguistically, in terms of conceptual schemas, but nevertheless, we should learn from their experience of encountering completely different ways of thinking. But all that aside, today I'd like to explore how Indian philosophy has challenged and enriched European intellectual history, and how this ongoing encounter calls for a new methodological approach I will refer to as Confluence philosophy. The ongoing encounter between Indian and Western philosophy represents not only a chapter in intellectual history, but a profound test of philosophy's own self-understanding. It is no longer sufficient to approach this encounter as a series of comparisons between East and West, or as the juxtaposition of distinct conceptual systems. What emerges instead is a need for a transformation, a methodological and conceptual shift that moves beyond the framework of comparative philosophy toward what has been termed confluence philosophy. This approach reorients philosophical inquiry from mere observation of difference to collaborative and transformative dialogue across traditions. Well, the legacy of Indian philosophy in the West is both rich and also troubled. The initial engagement was filtered through Orientalist, theological, and romantic lenses. And, well, I must say that we are still caught in the romantic stage. Figures like Schopenhauer, Deussen, and the American transcendentalists turned to Indian thought, especially in its Vedanta form and Samkhya, as a means to critique Enlightenment rationalism or to rediscover metaphysical depth. Partly it was also a reaction to Hegel's scathing critique of Asian philosophy as hardly philosophy at all. However, these encounters often treated India as a repository of spiritual otherness, and the philosophies themselves were interpreted through the categories of Western metaphysics or theology. The European philosophical imagination often saw India as both its origin and its opposite. This contradictory vision of India as philosophy's forgotten mirror has had long-lasting consequences. It has framed Indian thought as a precursor or supplement or deviation from a presumed Western norm. Yet the last century has seen a growing realization that Indian traditions offer more than metaphysical musings or ethical exotica. They offer rigorous, systematized philosophies that engage critically with epistemology, logic, metaphysics, and ethics. Well, I argue that we have now reached a moment of methodological maturity in which the encounter between Indian and Western philosophies can proceed not through exotization or fragmentation, but through philosophical confluence. Indian philosophy, and it should be understood in its pluralistic character, its modes of argumentation, and its conceptual sophistication, offers indispensable tools for shaping a genuinely integrative global philosophical discourse. So the earliest sustained European engagements with Indian philosophy took place under the rubric of comparative philosophy. Well, this model, which came into prominence during the late Enlightenment and early Romantic periods, was driven by the rise of philology, colonial scholarship, and growing awareness of cultural plurality. Indian philosophical systems, especially Vedanta, Yoga, Samkhya, were introduced into the European imagination through translations of Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads and other classical texts. Thinkers like Schopenhauer, who famously declared the Upanishads the consolation of his life and not incidentally called his poodles Atman and Brahman, and Max Müller, who edited and translated numerous Indian scriptures, helped establish an enduring but ambivalent framework. Indian thought as a source of spiritual wisdom rather than philosophical rigor. This interpretive stance often operated on the basis of analogy and affinity. Vedanta was likened to German idealism, Yoga to Stoicism or mysticism, and Buddhist Shunyata was assimilated, or sometimes misleadingly, into either nihilism or Kantianism. These comparisons, while not without insight, remain superficial and tended to reinforce a unidirectional flow. Indian systems were seen as precursors or analogues to European thought, not as equals or interlocutors in their own right. Indeed, even when comparative philosophy adopted an apparently neutral tone, it was often marked by asymmetry. European philosophy was the measuring rod, and Indian thought was evaluated by how closely it mirrored or deviated from familiar categories. This attitude, whether implicit or explicit, reproduced Eurocentric hierarchies within philosophy. What remained largely unacknowledged was the internal diversity, conceptual rigor, I can't stress this enough, and dialogical richness of Indian traditions themselves. Moreover, comparative philosophy frequently lacked a shared methodological ground. It compared finished doctrines rather than engaging in contemporary reasoning processes. There was little effort to enter into the epistemological frameworks, logical categories, and hermeneutical assumptions that gave Indian philosophies their shape and power. Well, in the second half of the 20th century, the optimism of comparative philosophy gave way to a deepened skepticism, marked by post-structuralist and post-colonial critiques concerning the very possibility of cross-cultural understanding. Well, this new intellectual climate emphasized difference, historicity, and incommensurability. Drawing from thinkers such as Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and Gayatri Spivak, many scholars argued that philosophical systems are deeply embedded in linguistic, cultural, and institutional matrices that resist translation or universalization. Now, the consequence was turn away from the pursuit of shared philosophical truth and towards the deconstruction of epistemic power. Indian philosophy within this model was often treated not as a co-equal partner in inquiry, but as a countersite, a foil that revealed the limits and violence of Western reason. While this move was important for unmasking colonial assumptions and Eurocentric frameworks, it also introduced a kind of methodological paralysis. If traditions are truly incommensurable, how can dialogue be anything more than gesture or appropriation? Now, this leads me to the next section, the middle path, confluence philosophy. Well, the intellectual exhaustion brought on by both uncritical comparison and radical incommensurability has opened the way for a new methodological attitude. What following the pioneering work of Mark Sideritz, a philosopher working at the intersection of analytic and Buddhist philosophy, especially Nagarjuna's Madhyamaka, calls confluence philosophy. Distinct from earlier models of comparison and postmodern skepticism, confluence philosophy represents a middle path, one that affirms pluralism without relativism, dialogue without erasure, and mutual transformation without appropriation. This term has been introduced and defined sometimes like this, that to do confluence philosophy is to philosophize across traditions, bringing their respective questions, concepts, and methods into joint deliberation without erasing the marks of their particular histories. Well, this definition is decisive. It neither aims for a universal synthesis nor resigns to incommensurable difference. Instead, confluence philosophy seeks to cultivate philosophical practice that is informed by multiple traditions, each retaining its integrity while contributing to a shared project of inquiry. It is not merely comparative, it is collaborative. In this sense, confluence philosophy is aligned with a vision of global philosophy that neither assumes universality nor denies it, but rather tests it. It asks whether concepts like consciousness, vijnana, mind, chitta, self, atman, or lack of atman thereof, anatman, emptiness, shunyata, or just reality, satya, can be thought with and through multiple traditions without either collapse or confusion. Now, on to Indian contributions to this vision of integrative global philosophy. To understand what Indian philosophy contributes to confluence philosophy, one must resist the tendency to treat Indian thought as a singular entity. Instead, the very diversity of India's philosophical traditions, ranging from Vedic metaphysics to Jain pluralism, from Buddhist critiques of selfhood to Nyaya logic, provides the conceptual ecosystem in which confluence thinking is already native. Take, for instance, the Jain doctrine of Anekantavada, the theory of multiple viewpoints, so to say, which insists that any metaphysical theory, any substantial monisms or neutral monisms or you name it, that any metaphysical theory can be approached from a plurality of valid yet partial perspectives. Probably one of the most influential Indian logicians of the last century, Bimal Krishna Matilal, emphasizes the philosophical depth of this view, arguing that it anticipates both modern epistemological humility and dialogical reasoning. He has shown that according to Jainism, reality is multifaceted. Different descriptions of the same thing may be true from different viewpoints. It is, however, essential to distinguish between the different standpoints. This notion of structured pluralism offers a powerful internal resource for confluence philosophy. It is not relativism, but a method of systematically coordinating truth across conceptual schemes. Similarly, Buddhist philosophy, particularly in its Madhyamaka form, provides tools for engaging metaphysical disagreements without reifying concepts. Nagarjuna's doctrine of shunyata, emptiness, not only critiques the notion of intrinsic essence, svabhava, but does so by deploying rigorous argumentation that seeks to dismantle dogmatic metaphysical commitments. Well, this invites a form of philosophy that is deconstructive but not destructive, dialogical but not merely descriptive. Buddhist philosophers do not merely offer alternatives to Western theories, but reconfigure the very terrain of philosophical inquiry. Their critiques of self, knowledge, and perception present not cultural anomalies, but sophisticated counter-arguments that any serious philosophical framework must address. Even within Vedanta, often stereotyped as monistic or mystical, there are deep debates and even divides between Advaita, Vishishtadvaita, and Dvaita that model forms of internal pluralism. By the way, the recipient of Nobel Prize in Economy, Indian economist Amartya Sen, a couple of decades ago wrote an absolutely beautiful book called The Argumentative Indian. It just reminds us all of us who have brought up on this idea that Indian philosophy is all about mysticism, that we oftentimes disregard the importance that Indian philosophers and thinkers have always throughout history attached to debate. Rigorous debate, Buddhists against Naiyayikas, different representatives of Vedanta. Even Shankara, as you might remember, was called a crypto-Buddhist at one point. Therefore, debate and fierce and rigorous debates based on specific logical rules is very typical of Indian philosophy. Now, a quick conclusion. The long and uneven encounter between Indian and Western philosophy has traversed phases of romanticization, reduction, resistance, and now possibly renewed collaboration. What began as a comparative project constrained by colonial asymmetries and Orientalist frameworks has evolved into something more methodologically daring. Confluence philosophy offers a vision of integrative global thought that neither assimilates difference into universality nor concedes to fragmentation. Instead, it fosters a practice of mutual engagement, where questions, concepts, and critiques are shared across traditions without collapsing them into a single normative system. And even necessity for looking for certain patterns of conceptual thought, not a universal system, but still something that we can see that different concepts from different Indian philosophical schools on a certain coordinate system align with specific terms we find in Western philosophy or we find in modern cognitive science. Indian philosophy, with its plural traditions and internal complexity, stand at the heart of this transformation. This is my assumption. Whether through the pluralist epistemology of Jainism, the deconstructive critique of Madhyamaka, or the analytical rigor of Nyaya, it provides resources not only for comparison, but for rethinking what philosophy is and what it could become. To move forward, we must do more than compare or admire. Even if my assumption is that both in different Indian systems of thought, and the same goes from Chinese schools of thinking, East Asian traditions, they must be brought into the dialogue, trying to tackle certain philosophical problems that are endemic to human condition. But at the same time, on one hand, it means a certain humility towards the other. But on the other hand, it does not mean that we somehow need to stop the critique, because at the core of philosophy as such is still an argument. And Indian philosophy does not lack argument at all. This is something neither Hegel knew, simply because most of the texts that are available in English or Russian or other language translations nowadays were not available to the Orientalists in the 19th century. We are, in this sense, we are much richer than all the others that came before us. So yes, I invite everyone to contemplate this proposal that we need to move towards a kind of new methodology that I, following my colleagues working within the field of Buddhist philosophy, call Confluence approach.